Well, good morning and welcome everyone to today's Resiliency Planning webinar series. This is a webinar series hosted by the MSU Extension Land Use Team and the MSU School of Planning, Design, and Construction. My name is Brad Newman. I'm a senior extension educator for MSU. I am based in Marquette County and do land use programming statewide. Some of my own programming focuses on resiliency, and so I'm excited to be the moderator for today's session. This is the fifth of 6 sessions in the Resiliency Planning webinar series, and we have hosted this session to this morning with 3 esteemed panelists that I'll introduce here momentarily. This session is focused on planning for resilient built infrastructure systems, and we'll be discussing the importance of incorporating resilient built infrastructure into our local and regional policy and planning documents. So at this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for this morning. First up, we have Erin Kuhn. Erin Kuhn is a resident of Muskegon and is the executive director of the West Michigan Shoreline Regional Development Commission. And she previously served as a planner and program manager there. She has more than 20 years of experience in regional economic development, community development, and local government services. She is the president of the Michigan Association of Regions, and Ms. Kuhn holds an associate degree from Muskegon Community College and a bachelor's degree in communications from Grand Valley. So thanks, Erin, for joining us. Our next speaker in the series this morning is Scott Whitcomb. He is a senior advisor for wildlife and public lands in the DNR Executive Division. Scott works on a variety of DNR priority areas, including renewable energy transition for facilities, public lands across the state, and using natural and working lands as climate solutions. He has a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife from MSU and a master's in wildlife management from the University of Maine. He's a fellow black bear of mine. He's worked in the Appalachians of Southwest Virginia, managing state wildlife areas, and has worked for the Michigan DNR since 1998 as a biologist and a specialist in public lands. In his current role in the DNR, Scott serves as co-chair of the Natural Working Lands and Forest Products Work Group of the Council of Climate Solutions. And again, that's in the DNR Executive Division. Welcome, Scott. Our third panelist this morning is George Berghorn. He's an assistant professor of construction management in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction at MSU, and he advises the Student Builders and Contractors Association as well. George earned his PhD in construction management from MSU and a master's of environmental studies from Yale University. George is a LEED accredited professional in building design and construction and a certified green professional from the National Association of Home Builders. He's worked on funded projects related to the feasibility of building deconstruction and material reuse, barriers to increasing mass timber building construction, reuse of salvage lumber and cross-laminated timber, the role of construction activities in aquatic invasive species introduction and spread, building science education, and electric utility training. Prior to his career in higher education, George was a site superintendent and construction project manager in the US and a policy director for a statewide trade association. Welcome, George. So each of our presenters will spend some time talking about some of their thoughts and ideas in this topic of resilient built infrastructure systems. And as we're going, we would welcome folks to put their questions into the Q&A. That is a separate tool as compared to the chat function. Please use the Q&A tool, and we'll be collecting questions as they come in, and we'll be able to address those questions across our 3 panelists at the end of the session this morning. So with that, I'd like to welcome Erin to pull up her screen and get us started with today's webinar.
And thanks everybody for joining us this morning. I'm going to start out by talking about our current built infrastructure here in the state of Michigan. As you can see here, we have a significant amount of asset owners across the state. You can see the chart here on the right shows all of that. And this is a little bit older, probably about 3 years old. So we know there are even more infrastructure owners out there, probably close to 3,500. And it's really an expansive and complex network that we have when you look at our roads, water, drinking water, wastewater, our county drains, our mass transit. And this doesn't even include our bridges and culverts and airports or commercial ports out there, water ports. So there is quite an extensive network of the built infrastructure that we have in the state of Michigan, and it is aging. When we think about the age of infrastructure, it can be in the ground for 100 years, especially, that the water lines, the electric lines, the wastewater lines. So these are very old, aging, some of them, infrastructure that we have, and in need of replacement. And it costs an awful lot of money to be able to do that. The funding sources are very limited for making improvements and replacing and maintaining that infrastructure. And when you think about cross infrastructure collaboration, and there's very unsynchronized funding sources. So when you're doing a large scale infrastructure project, it's very hard to get funding to address all of the infrastructure within a road right of way at the same time. So that really leads to the infrastructure being managed in silos. And when all of us across the state understand that when you rip up a road and replace the surface of the road, a couple years later, there's a water line break or a sewer line break, you've got to rip up that road and do additional work underneath, or private utilities need to go in and make some replacements or expansions. So it's really done in silos and hasn't historically been coordinated. And we're trying to fix that at the state level. So what is this impact on us every day? We really don't think a lot about some of this infrastructure, especially, our water and wastewater, until it doesn't work. We go to turn on that faucet and it doesn't work, or, it's backing up into our basements, or we're having, to have car repairs done because we're hitting potholes, and we're in pothole season right now. That has a huge impact on us, when it's not. And how we can just manage the two together to make things more resilient in the state of Michigan and for our infrastructure. So about 3 years ago, the state created the Michigan Infrastructure Council, and I sit on that council as a governor appointee and voting member. And we came up with 5 key goals that we really want to do in looking at Michigan's infrastructure from a holistic standpoint. We want to make sure we're educating not only our legislature, but just the general citizens and everybody in between on the infrastructure and the condition of the infrastructure that we have. Really understanding, doing that research so we know what we have and the condition of our infrastructure and how we can manage that going forward. How can we coordinate better across assets, and how can we then prioritize once we know what we have? How can we prioritize what needs to be done first, second, and what's critical in there? And then how can we collaborate across infrastructure assets and across communities and asset owners? And then how can we better invest the very limited amount of money that we have to be able to improve and build upon the infrastructure that we have? And so we have identified 3 key initiatives that we are working on at the Michigan Infrastructure Council. One is the Asset Management Readiness Assessment Scale that was introduced last spring for communities and asset owners to complete that scale, which really helps them identify where they are in the culture of asset management and how to move and build their knowledge in asset management. And then what was recently introduced is the Dig Once project portal. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But and then now we are in the process of developing a 30-year infrastructure strategy on how we can manage infrastructure going forward across the state. So the asset management self-assessment readiness scale, like I said, was introduced last year. And we have been working with communities and asset owners to go through this self-assessment. And it really takes a deep dive into 5 competency areas of asset management. And that includes people and leadership. So I'm going to use a community as an example. You know, they have, they may own roads, water lines, sewer lines, making sure that everybody understands asset management from the boots on the ground practitioner all the way through the staff, the finance managers, the city managers, and then the elected officials, all kind of being on the same page, understanding the importance of asset management and how that can better serve the customers that are benefiting from the infrastructure that is provided through that community. And then having data and information, really understanding the condition of the data that they have, and then being able to take that data into powerful information. Data is just data unless we can use it to make decisions, informed decisions. So then that leads to policy and governance, having asset management policies in place, again, across a community, again, all the way from the practitioner on the ground, boots on the ground folks, through the staff and up to the elected officials. And then taking that policy and putting it into planning documents and decision makings that we have across the board, how that culture is just infiltrated. And then external communication and knowledge. How can we share the data and information and policies that we have put in place, not only to throughout the organization itself, but externally to the community and the customers that are benefiting from the assets that community is offering across or to their citizens. And then what that self-assessment also does is allows communities to set goals in 1 year, 3 year, 5 year of how they can identify where they want to be to advance their knowledge and advance their use of asset management within that community. And then next, the project portal, which was just introduced last month. That is a way to help coordinate and projects across assets across the state of Michigan. To date, within the last month, we have over 10,000 projects that have been submitted into this project portal, which will allow for assets, both public and private, when it's a GIS-based portal. And when there's 2 projects happening within a geographic area, each asset owner will get a little ping saying how they, there's another project happening in that corridor. How can they then, there's contact information, and then they can get together and identify how they can maybe collaborate, coordinate on that project, and maybe save money. We know that in large scale projects where there's a significant amount of collaboration and multi-projects happening at the same time, we can save anywhere between 30 and 40% of the overall total project cost if there is collaboration. And it also minimizes the impact on the general citizens that are traveling across that corridor as well, if it's that project, those multiple projects are happening all at the same time. And then why asset management? And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history of how we've been managing our assets over the past 100 years, and how we know through asset management we can better manage what we have, and how we can do that more efficiently into the future. In the past, we really have been doing, we've been managing our assets instead of doing asset management. And there's a very different relationship, and you can see here in the slide, between those two. Historically, we didn't have the technology that we have today, the GIS mapping, to be able to know and have digitally mapped what's in the ground and when it was put in there, and exactly where it is. So you might have a city manager that has been with a community for 40 years, and all of the information is either handwritten on a map or in his head. And then he retires, and so does all that institutional knowledge of where that infrastructure is in the ground. We now know that we can, with the technology that we have, we can digitize all of that, and that can transcend DPW directors and staff in a community to be able to understand where that is, what needs to better plan when maintenance needs to happen, when replacement needs to happen, when that infrastructure is coming to end of life. We're able to plan decades out when that will happen, and be a little bit more predictable in the money that we need to spend to be able to maintain that infrastructure. And then in the long run, that really helps make those communities more resilient in understanding the criticality of the infrastructure that they have, and when it needs to be replaced, and just the general maintenance of that infrastructure. So with the Michigan Infrastructure Council in 2018, when that was created, the legislature also created the Water Asset Management Council and made some changes to the Transportation Asset Management Council. The Transportation Asset Management Council, TAMC, has been around for nearly 20 years and really has set the stage for how we can do asset management on the transportation side of things. There's a significant amount of data that has been collected through that process, and partnering with the Michigan Association of Regions. There are 14 regions across the state, and the Michigan Department of Transportation through TAMC, and the Michigan Infrastructure Council and the WAMC, Water Asset Management Council, are really working and partnering with the Michigan Association of Regions to help work at the local level, the regional level, to implement asset management and just get the word out about asset management and educate on what we can do and what is asset management. Because in the scope of infrastructure, asset management is a fairly new concept, and we're just trying to advance that culture. And the Michigan Association of Regions really has the finger on the pulse of our regional communities. We work with them very closely. We help them do economic development planning, environmental planning, and on the transportation side, we do the transportation asset management, and really work very closely with those communities and their planning documents. So I know in our 5-county region in West Michigan, when we're working with a community, helping them update their master plan, for example, we are encouraging them to go through and complete the asset management self-assessment and put that as an appendix to their master plan. So they, in future years, when they're reviewing their master plan, they can take a look at that self-assessment, give it an update, and understand where they are and how they can make those next steps in doing their advancing their culture of asset management. And that's pretty much all I have. Oh, one more thing I did want to add for the Michigan Infrastructure Council, another initiative that we actually are kicking off tomorrow is a asset management champion program. And we're kicking that off tomorrow. There's nearly 100 folks that we will be, that have signed up voluntarily to go through that program. And again, it's looking at those 5 competency areas of asset management and doing a very deep dive to just further educate the practitioners. We have everybody from state employees to practitioners, DPW directors, elected officials, that are in this first 100 cohort that we're doing. And I think it's just a wonderful opportunity to see what the Michigan Infrastructure Council is doing and how we can just further how we're managing this. And the state of Michigan is really unique in doing not necessarily asset management, but doing the cross asset, looking at our infrastructure from a holistic standpoint. And there are, like I mentioned in my first slide, there are many other infrastructure assets that we can be looking at. Right now, we're just really focusing on transportation, drinking water, and wastewater. But there, like I mentioned, there's green infrastructure, there's bridges and culverts and county drains and airports and municipal buildings as well. And when you look at the asset management self-assessment scale, that really can be applied to any asset, parks, and that we have. So that's all I have. And I just want to thank you for allowing me to speak.
Hey, thanks, Erin. We appreciate you being with us this morning, and we'll look forward to taking some questions from participants a little later. As you were talking, I was thinking about Michigan. I imagine one thing that is unique is the number of infrastructure managers or owners we do have, with all the units of government we have, different authorities, and just how critical coordination is. And it's good to see the new tools and resources from the MIC that'll help with coordination. I was also thinking with the American Rescue Plan and new dollars coming to local government, that's of course a tremendous opportunity, but it really stresses the importance of coordination with all those new projects that might be being moved forward. And so
Correct.
Not only coordination across those different entities, but within any unit of government, from the infrastructure manager to the elected officials, and that whole governance piece that you mentioned too. So very valuable, important work.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And Scott, we will be turning to Scott Whitcomb with the DNR here now. Scott?
So good morning. I'm Scott Whitcomb, Senior Advisor for Wildlife and Public Lands in Michigan DNR. And this morning I'm going to be talking about resiliency in our natural and working lands, specifically our state land base here in Michigan, and using these lands as part of natural climate solutions. The current Whitmer administration has been a strong proponent of recognizing, preparing for, and mitigating a changing climate. In addition to enrolling Michigan in the United States Climate Alliance, recent executive actions have created the Climate Solutions Council and tasked state government to create the My Healthy Climate Plan. And so that the My Healthy Climate Plan, which is still being established, puts Michigan on a path to economy-wide carbon neutrality by the year 2050, with interim goals by 2025 to ensure steady progress. And it directs state agencies to reduce energy use by 40% by 2040, and requires that all new state facilities are carbon neutral by 2040. And so as a state agency, Michigan DNR has a role to play in these actions, certainly with the built environment, but also with our land base, with some of the facilities we have there, working towards resiliency, as well as an energy transition. So when you think about Michigan and the lands managed by the Department of Natural Resources, it's pretty vast. We have one of the largest state land bases in the country. Other states have a lot of federal lands, and Michigan's no exception there. We have 3.2 million acres of federal land. But the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, manages 4.6 million acres of public lands on behalf of the residents and visitors to Michigan. And these are in almost every county. There are 103 state parks, countless fish hatcheries, about a 4 million acre state forest system, wildlife areas, and trail networks. And these include many iconic places like Tequendon Falls State Park, Hartwood Pines, Pigeon River Country State Forest, and they're visited by millions of Michiganders and tourists each year. So what is this infrastructure? A lot of times when you think about natural lands, you may not think about the infrastructure that's located there. But Michigan DNR actually manages a pretty vast infrastructure system on our lands. That includes 13,000 miles of roads, 13,000 miles of trail, 1,000 boat access sites, bridges, culverts, dams. And a lot of this is sort of off the radar. And so when the governor's talking about fixing the roads, she's not really talking about our roads. We're kind of on our own with that. So we're primarily self-funded. And so when we get into a changing climate, it really puts these facilities at risk. We've seen our Great Lakes water levels go from record lows to record high in record time. And we've got increased frequency and intensity of storm events. And anytime this happens, it not only puts human life at risk, but it also threatens this infrastructure. A good example of this is the events recently in Houghton County in 2018. There was a 1,000-year flood event that took out a lot of the trail networks up there. And this was followed by an estimated 100-year event soon after. And the damage from these two storm events in rapid succession was assessed at over $20 million. And so as DNR plans for our built infrastructure, we really need to take into account these storm events and make sure our facilities and infrastructure are built resilient in a resilient fashion to really account for this and to climate proof our infrastructure going forward. Because not only does this affect DNR's operation, but it affects tourism and local economies when these facilities get washed out and taken out. So shifting gears a little bit, we also talk about a commitment towards energy transition and decarbonization of our operations. And this has been a priority under this administration, our DNR director, and with good reason. We feel it's a great alignment with our agency mission towards conservation of natural resources and environmental protection. And so we've embraced the transition to clean energy, and we're committed to being leaders in this area across state government. So we're looking at reducing our carbon footprint, and we really feel this is aligned quite well with our agency's mission. So one of the things we're doing is looking at our facilities, each of them, as to whether they would be suitable for converting to solar energy as opposed to fossil fuels. And one of the first places we looked was at our fish hatcheries. We have eight fish hatcheries across the state. In those 8 hatcheries, out of 1,000 DNR buildings, those 8 hatcheries consume about 1/6 of the total energy supply required. And the reason is because they're moving with pumps vast quantities of water as they're watering and dewatering different ponds and keeping the water moving to keep the fish healthy. So we're looking at each of these for their suitability for adapting to solar. The first one we were able to put online was at the Odin State Fish Hatcheries Visitor Center near Petoskey. And so we expect to do more of these. We've got an RFP out right now for the Wolf Lake site in Southwest Michigan, and we're going to be looking at some of our others as well. And I spoke of alignment of mission. These are public use facilities, so they have visitor centers. They have a lot of people that walk through them to see the fish. They're high visibility. They attract tourists. With these solar panels go in, they get a lot of publicity, and so they can serve an educational function as well by siting these on our state facilities. And the public really likes to see these. You know, one of the comments after this went on, even in the time of COVID, is folks are getting out, they're walking their dogs, whatever, on our lands, and the folks that work there said they'd really like to see the solar on our facilities. And so We were also looking at, those are sort of the facility scale type projects, but we're also looking at utility scale, which are larger things out in front of the meter that could put solar energy on the grid. So we're looking at our 4.6 million acre land base for the potential of generating clean power. And so a lot of DNR is not suitable for this. I mentioned we have a 4 million acre state forest system. Those are working forest lands, and so they're productive. They have trees. They're not conducive to solar energy production in a lot of cases. Our lands are used for wildlife habitat, public recreation. So a lot of them just aren't suitable. But with a portfolio of the size that we have, if you get opportunities where the land looks like the picture on the screen, it may be suitable for solar. So we've got brownfields that we manage, post-industrial sites, lands that are in some sort of degraded condition. They may not support trees. But they may be suitable where they're in close proximity to transmission lines. They may be suitable for solar. This picture is of the Groveland mine tailing site. So there's not a lot growing on that site. So, and yet because of the past industrial uses, it's in close proximity to electrical transmission. And so we're looking at putting solar there. This slide is just a little recap of some of our efforts on public lands for utility scale solar. I mentioned sites in degraded conditions. We're looking at old gravel pits, former mine sites. They do have to be in close proximity to interconnection for the grid. Typically, the sweet spot is under 2 miles, under 3 miles. The first two sites we put online are Groveland Mine and the 7 Mile Pit, and those were each leased by a developer, Copper Country Power, and they're working through the process to see if they can bring those sites online now. So they're in the process of doing the interconnection studies and trying to find an energy buyer. There's some benefits from a land use perspective to having the state do this. One is the power developers are dealing with just one entity as opposed to several different entities with private landowners. And it's not taking productive agricultural lands offline if we're bringing some of these degraded brownfields and industrial sites into the development portfolios. So we're looking at other state lands. There's other state agencies looking at this. I've got a call later today, and one of the strongest proponents of this is, believe it or not, Department of Corrections. They have land and they're looking at these same things at the facility scale or at the utility scale. And then switching over to the third aspect of our work on resiliency, and that is looking at mitigation of climate through sequestration of carbon. And so, as you probably all are aware, growing trees sequester carbon, and this sequestered carbon can be sold as credits to offset carbon emissions for industry or others wanting to reduce their carbon footprint. And so this has been available on private forest lands for some time, but no one at the scale that Michigan DNR is working has put any publicly owned lands into this market space. And so Michigan DNR wanted to try and see whether our lands would be viable for this. And so we're piloting a project at the Pigeon River Country State Forest to see whether we can sequester and sell carbon credits there. And the Pigeon River Country was chosen specifically because it is a working forest. It's home of Michigan's elk herd. Elk have been there for over 100 years now. It's a relatively small forest. It's about 120,000 acres, but it's managed for unique values. And we feel that carbon, the co-benefits of carbon sequestration fit well with the management of the area. And so we issued an RFP, and we're currently working with a project developer named Blue Source as to develop this using the American Carbon Registry protocols and improved forest management methodologies. And these credits are independently verified, and they'll be sold on the voluntary market. So they'll be sold to companies who are making a corporate commitment to reducing their carbon footprint. So folks like Google, Amazon, the big three automakers, and others. And I mentioned that it fits pretty well with what we're trying to do in the forest there. So these areas are working forests now. Working forests support elk habitat, which is important, and so we still need to manage these areas for a variety of forest products. And the improved forest management allows timber harvest and accounts for durable forest products like telephone poles. After these trees are cut down, if they're used in a durable forest product, that carbon's still sequestered for the lifespan of that product. So we're promoting mass timber, those types of things for using these timber products. And other states are looking at the same thing. We polled other states around the country, and fully half of them are looking at similar programs for their state lands. And as we look at some of these ideas to mitigate climate change, there's obviously probably going to be some critics that say that there isn't a place on our public lands working towards natural climate solutions or using these lands for renewable energy. But these same lands have been used by the fossil fuel industry for decades for producing fossil fuels. And so, there may be a place for renewable energy on them as well. So that is the extent of my slideshow. So I'll stop sharing, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. And of course, those fossil fuel producing lands have also helped to fund countless, natural resource projects or recreation projects through Natural Resources Trust Fund and similar investments. I was thinking about Aaron's presentation in asset management, and of course, those natural resources also being assets. What you're doing at the DNR is also asset management in a little different lens. And I think communities themselves can think across that spectrum too. Of course, the built infrastructure, but also the natural resource that is an asset to be managed for recreation, for carbon sequestration as a source of energy. Endless ways that a more sustainable future might make use of that resource.
Absolutely. And as we look at things like the Biden administration's plan for 30 by 30, we would want to consider those local assets as well as the state and federal assets towards, contributing towards those goals. So yeah, I think you're right.
Thanks, Scott. And we'll round the presentation panel out with Dr. George Berghorn.
I'm going to share a little bit of a different perspective on some work that we're doing at MSU, combining a couple of different areas that I work in: mass timber construction, dome ecology, which if you haven't heard of that word before, that's okay. We'll define that. And then looking at some climate adaptation ties and some other resilience ties to those particular topics. One of the things that I've long thought about is, what do climate response strategies look like in terms of whether they're benefiting carbon budgets or not? And so lately, there's been a lot of interest around this idea of managed retreat or planned retreat, getting physical infrastructure buildings away from coastal areas as we think about what the impacts of climate change are on sea level rise and frequency and severity of natural disasters. But really, managed retreat is not that new of an idea. And this is a picture from New York. This is West Hurley, New York, and the Catskills, right prior to the creation of the Ashokan Reservoir for New York City. So my first job, first professional job while I was still in school, was working for the New York City Water Supply. And we managed all of the watershed lands in upstate New York. And it was, a well-known part of history, at least in New York State, that when the New York City water supply system was built, many, many towns and villages in upstate New York were relocated or simply just taken over and flooded to create the reservoirs that would provide water for the city. And so there was a planned retreat or a managed retreat process going on well over 100 years ago, and we've seen it repeated time and again. Like I said, now we think of it more in the context of sea level rise and changing frequency and severity of climate disasters. But my question has long been, as we get into these activities, where do the buildings go? What do we do with these buildings? And what tends to happen is that buildings are demolished, material is gathered up, taken to landfill. Very rarely in the modern context of managed retreat do we see much work with the reuse of building materials. So if we're sort of looking to mitigate one climate disaster by moving buildings, and then we create a situation where we take these buildings, landfill them, and create new carbon emissions potentially from that landfilled material, are we just sort of trading off one disaster for another disaster? Or is our response to one disaster potentially not really helping the very situation that we're trying to mitigate as we create potentially more carbon emissions through this process? So I want to introduce you to the concept of dome ecology and looking at how we can mitigate some of this issue. It begins with this sort of simple graphic of how we tend to treat our built environment, where we extract raw materials, we process them into building materials, we construct, and then at the end of life of a building, we tend to demolish those buildings. We recycle a fraction of that building material, and then we landfill the rest. This is kind of this very linear concept of how we manage the built environment all the way through from cradle to grave. And what dome ecology has been suggesting is that instead we should think about more of a circular economy approach, where instead of demolition, we're deconstructing. As a result of deconstruction, we're either reusing material, building material directly, or we're recycling it. And when we recycle it, that material is either getting processed and reused directly as a new building material, or that material is being processed and repurposed into new materials that can be used in different applications and different contexts. So this notion of dome ecology, which was started here at MSU, is that we should really think about the end of life of a building as we get into the planning and design process to put buildings onto our landscape. And so if we take that lens and use that in the managed retreat case, for example, we would then see that we have sort of two paths that are in front of us. We can either react to what we have to do with these buildings that need to come off the landscape, or we can plan to be more proactive and say, well, maybe we should think about ways to design our buildings so that when they reach the end of their life, it's more efficient and more likely that we would undertake a process to deconstruct those buildings and salvage those materials. So this is my requisite academic figure that I have to put in every presentation, or I don't get paid for being a professor. So here's your academic figure for the day. This comes out of a journal article that we published 2 years ago explaining what dome ecology is and sort of setting out the research agenda for it. And you can see there's inputs to the system on the left-hand side, the policies, regulations, and incentives that determine how we handle our built environment, markets and supply chain for salvaged material, the potential for designing for deconstruction or designing for deconstruction and reuse, workforce availability to take these structures down and salvage materials, and then what's the nature and quantity of the abandoned structures or the structures that we're trying to manage? You know, are these buildings that are in good shape, or these buildings that have been blighted where maybe a significant amount of the material is not usable? But what I really want to point your attention to here is, you know, we can either be in this reactive situation, which is where we tend to be today, think Detroit and taking buildings off the landscape in Detroit, where because we have to react to a large number of buildings that were maybe not designed to have their materials efficiently gathered and reused, we tend to see more use of demolition. On the proactive side, though, we can avoid future abandonment and blight by creating structures that are adaptable, that are flexible in their reuse, as well as adaptable and flexible in their ability to provide materials back into the supply chain to get an extended life and be used further in other applications. I'm going to come back to that and explain some of that in the context of another example here. So if we think about how this dome ecological framework can help avoid additional carbon emissions, I want to put a different example out for you, which is mass timber buildings. There's been a lot of interest in what mass timber is and the development of these structures in the United States. This is the first mass timber building in this picture that you're seeing here in Michigan. That's the STEM teaching and learning facility here on campus at MSU. So it's the very first mass timber building that's being constructed in the state. Looks a lot different from this picture right now. I wanted to get a picture where you would see just how much timber is in the structure. You can't really see that anymore as it's completely clad with brick and limestone and glass. But there's a large amount of timber in the structural frame and some of the walls of this building as well. And when we look at this building and look at the amount of wood that's in it, we see that that wood that's creating that structural frame and the floors stores about 1,900 metric tons of CO2, which sounds like a lot. It's the equivalent to 4.5 million vehicle miles driven per year, or 394 cars driven for that 1 year, or 222 homes energy use for 1 year. But more than the carbon that's stored in that material, we also have avoided emissions from manufacturing steel and concrete. So if that building were to have been built in steel or concrete, more conventional means, not only would we not have the sequestration benefit of that building, but we would have additional emissions being generated for the larger quantity of concrete and steel. Now, this is a hybrid building, so there is some concrete and steel in it, but the quantities are nowhere near what they would be if it was a solely reinforced concrete or solely steel building. The problem with that 1,900 metric ton of CO2 equivalent number is that if we look at the MSU power plant, the TV Simon plant, that number is only equivalent to about 2 days of emissions from our power plant at MSU. So one building by itself really is almost just sort of a blip in the grander picture of carbon management on campus or in Michigan. But if mass timber gets to scale, and thinking about what it would take to get this construction technique to scale, and that's some of the work that we're doing in my group, is looking at some of the barriers in industry and breaking those barriers down to bring this method to scale. And Scott was mentioning, voluntary carbon markets in his presentation. We're actually starting to look at some scenario planning exercises where we want to see what would happen under various carbon regulatory scenarios, how that would impact industry response and maybe getting mass timber to scale. So let's look at what happens if it gets to scale. If we get to a point where half of Michigan commercial construction, is done in mass timber going forward, now we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 200,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent that would be sequestered in those buildings. Every year you'd be building new buildings that would sequester another 1 to 200,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So if we get to scale, we see that maybe we start to see larger kind of landscape level impacts. And one of the questions that I get a lot is, well, what's the service life of these wood buildings? Are you just building something with wood that itself will eventually end up in the landfill? And the best way I can answer this question is our building at MSU is built to have up to a 100-year service life. But as we also know, on campus at MSU, we continue to operate many buildings that are closing in on that 100-year service life from the time they were first built. And there's really no plans to replace those buildings. Through good asset management strategies on campus, we're able to do really good preventive maintenance and keep the lifespan of the buildings on campus running for a long period of time. In Seattle, Washington, there's a building called the Bullitt Center, also done in mass timber, and that building is predicted to have a 250-year service life. So, I think people sometimes think of wood buildings as homes, light frame wood buildings, but these are constructed very differently, and we think about much longer potential service lives with these buildings. So a question was posed to me recently about, well, mass timber is really interesting. And if we look at this broader issue of climate change and what that might do to land cover in a place like Michigan, it also gives us an opportunity to think about how mass timber might be a response sort of in our toolkit if we see climate change impact species composition in our forests. So right now in Michigan, through the northern lower peninsula, red pine is abundant, and there's a significant economic activity in Michigan built around red pine, a lot of pole manufacturing using red pine. This is this is white spruce, also an economically valuable, I'm sorry, red spruce. This is an economically valuable species in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. You can see the range map in green where the traditional range for red spruce is. So red pine and red spruce typically have these more northern oriented ranges. The concern is if we start to see long-term climate effects, what's that going to do to the range of red pine and red spruce? And we don't know what that's going to do. It's likely going to push it further north, or it's going to stress economically important plantations in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. But one species that's able to do much better in warmer temperatures is white pine. White pine doesn't have quite the economic value that red pine and red spruce have currently, but white pine could be used as an important component of mass timber. So white pine could be more readily used in glulam and cross-laminated timber. And so as we see climate change and range of species changing, we may actually see better opportunity through mass timber to utilize a species like white pine. But now going back to that dome ecology framework, one of our group's questions is, well, what about promoting ongoing carbon sequestration in long-lived wood products? So if we have all these homes around the state that are wood framed, they're made out of 2x4 lumber, what happens to these structures when they hit the end of their useful lives? Spoiler alert, they tend to get demolished and landfilled. So we're putting a lot of lumber into the landfill. In fact, most years we tend to landfill more wood in the US than we harvest off of the federal forest system. So we landfill significant amounts of wood in the US. So we've been looking at, can we take lumber from home deconstruction projects and put it into mass timber products? Can we make glue laminated timber and cross laminated timber out of salvaged lumber? And so this is two of my students working on assessing the mechanical qualities of that material, some pictures of students of mine from the past working through processing this material. And without boring you with a lot of engineering data about what we're finding out, in essence, what we're finding out is that the raw material from a mechanical perspective tests out very well. It's good quality material that we're encountering. So the material has great promise to be used in mass timber products. This table points to the utility of this salvaged material to be used in cross-laminated timber. So you can see in the third column over, about 90% of our samples, 90% plus of our samples are usable in CLT production, and about 95% or more of our samples are usable in glue laminated timber production. So now if we can start to move material that's maybe was in use for 100 years, it was 100 or 200 years old when it was harvested, it was destined for the landfill, but we can now capture that material and put it into productive use for another 100 years, we're further extending the carbon sequestration potential of that material. And we know that if we extend the life of salvaged wood, and we've looked at a number of different scenarios, this is kind of a base scenario, that if we can go to 50% source reduction, meaning we're replacing wood in mass timber with salvaged material, so 50% of the wood from one house could go to source reduction, 20% could go to recycling, and then you end up with a lot of material that still can't be reused. So we figured 11.5% goes to the landfill, 18.5% goes to wood to energy combustion. you're still looking at a 6.4 metric ton of CO2 equivalent reduction per house. This is for a 1,200 square foot house in Michigan. So that's a small amount per home. But if we apply that to the 226,000 abandoned structures in the state, we have the potential to save over 1.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent if we can find ways to put this salvaged wood or potentially salvageable wood into productive use as a long-lived harvested wood product. Some closing thoughts on mass timber and resilience. Just worth pointing out that, again, the other question I get frequently about timber buildings, well, don't they burn? This is an old picture from the 60s, commercial building after a fire. You can see the large solid timber here with the nails sticking out of it. Post-fire was just fine, but the steel beams in the building actually deformed because of the high heat of the fire and deformed over the timber. This is just a fire simulation that was done by the Forest Service, and the takeaway on these fire simulations is that what we know with mass timber, these large cross-sectional wooden structural members, is that they don't burn through, they char. This gives you that sense of what the charring looks like on the right, and so you upsize the members so that when they burn, the char layer that's formed still leaves you an adequate structural cross-section so that the building can remain standing even after a fire, so that it gives people time to get out of the building. And then the last point, this is just some shake table testing that was done on a 7-story CLT structure. It was a joint effort between the European Union and Japan. And so they took this 7-story mass timber building and subjected it to the Fukushima earthquake, the San Francisco 1904 earthquake, the Northridge earthquake. They ran about 7-8 different well-known earthquakes against the building. And because of the elastic properties of wood, these buildings behave actually quite well under seismic conditions. So if we're thinking about expanded definitions of resilience, resilience to fire, resilience to seismic activity, timber seems to have some promise in that regard as well. So with that, I went a little over time, so thank you for your attention, and I'll be very happy to take your questions when we get to that part of the session.
Thank you very much, George. Yeah, fascinating. I'll remind our audience to continue to put questions into the Q&A. We're gathering those right now. George, we'll stick with you. It seems to many of our participants, mass timber is somewhat of a new concept, and I think you were getting at the answer to this question right towards the end. The distinguishing factors between mass timber and just regular construction, is it really that scale and the idea of loading, right? The scaling up of the size of the structural timbers for holding the mass of the building?
Yeah, so mass timber is typically the wooden elements in a mass timber structure cross-sectionally are typically going to be 8 inches in each cross-sectional dimension or greater. So these are very large sections. So that distinguishes it from like a light frame application. And then we've done heavy timber and post and beam construction, timber frame construction for hundreds of years in the US. The distinguishing between mass timber and that older technique is that we're not using in mass timber, in the current conception of mass timber, we're not typically using solid sawn cross-sectional material because you know, I don't know if anyone's tried buying wood lately. It's, you can't even find 6x6 lumber, let alone anything larger than that. And so most mass timber products are just laminations of smaller cross-sectional area, wooden members, and resin to make that larger cross-section. And then now we also have the ability to do floors and walls with cross-laminated timber, where we didn't do that with like post and beam construction in the past.
Thanks. And George, you mentioned Detroit or other, urban areas where we've seen decades of, lack of investment, and we've seen displacement, other, government, local, state, federal policies that have displaced individuals. we know we need to reuse that infrastructure. And so this is maybe a question that sort of goes to both George and Aaron. You know, how do we get not only to the reuse of those construction materials, but how do we get back to reuse of that built infrastructure? Because, you know, as we look to meet the housing needs that we have in the state, you know, we have lots of infrastructure that exists in our cities that is underutilized, and we often continue to grow outward spatially as opposed to, you know, recycling that existing infrastructure in the ground. Thoughts to share on that concept?
Sure, I can kind of address that from the built infrastructure, the gray infrastructure that we have. I know at the state level, especially the Michigan Department of Transportation is really focused on maintaining and improving the existing transportation system that we have, as opposed to building new and expansion of the infrastructure that we have. Yeah, there really has been a shift in you know, refocusing our efforts to the existing infrastructure, rebuilding and revitalizing our downtown areas, which have that existing infrastructure, as opposed to moving outward. So that it's a slow shift, but it really is happening across the state and really nationally as well. And one thing that I try to explain to people is that with the infrastructure that we have, it is, and the condition that it's in right now, it's taken us decades to get into the situation we are right now. It's going to take decades to get out of the situation we're in. So it's a slow process. We're trying to move that pendulum of how we manage assets and really looking into, you know, how we reuse what we have and how we maintain and rebuild existing.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with municipal plans and policies for expansion of that infrastructure, or what that future land use map might show for, you know, the turnover of land from a natural or you know, green state to developed state. Going on that line a little bit. Go ahead. Sorry, Aaron. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say it's extremely expensive as well to do that, ever expanding, you know, moving into and extending that infrastructure into natural areas. In the long run, it really is much more expensive to manage than it is to focus inward on the existing to maintain and replace that existing. It's a lot more just financially responsible to do that.
Along those lines, there's a question, Aaron, for you relating to sustainability approaches within infrastructure. You know, that could be energy efficiency. You know, perhaps we can think of energy efficiency with wastewater handling. There's a key location or aspect where major infrastructure that has major energy requirements. Is that a conversation of the Michigan Infrastructure Council?
Absolutely. That has been intertwined in our conversation since day one. You know, not only getting a handle of our infrastructure and how we maintain and improve that, but the sustainability, long-term sustainability, and reducing that footprint. So yeah, that absolutely has been included in the conversation. And I know, you know, the regional partners across the state, the 14 planning regions, are also very involved in sustainability from not only the environmental side, but the gray infrastructure side as well.
And how about transportation infrastructure? We know electric vehicles are coming on strong. We know our infrastructure is not all that ready to handle electric vehicles, and we'll stop there. We don't need to talk about autonomous vehicles yet, but how about conversations that you are party to related to transportation and electrification? Any thoughts to share there?
Yeah, definitely. That has also been a conversation, not only at the state level, but the local levels as well, making sure there are charging stations where they need to be, and the charging, really that's a big part of the electric, having those electrical vehicles, is that, the distance they can travel, and having enough charging stations to make sure people can travel and do what they need to do with their vehicles as that technology advances. So that is a big conversation. And each of the metropolitan areas that are the MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, we have long range transportation plans, and this language and conversation is in those documents as we update those every 5 years, and in coordination with the state and the state's transportation plan as well.
And I think this relates to Scott's presentation in terms of solar on state-owned lands. Certainly, as we talk about in a more electric future, the need for solar as a source of electric vehicle charging, as one example, becomes greater and greater. I know the DNR has done studies of solar potential on facilities. Scott, what have you seen, or do you know in terms of just Michigan's capacity for solar? Certainly we're not Arizona, but does solar make sense to go all in here in Michigan as far as what you've seen?
Surprisingly, yes. It seems like the technology is coming along, so the panels are more efficient. Even some of the studies that we've looked at, citing solar in the UP, is viable, and it's really the least expensive way to go, is these utilities to look to put that type of generation infrastructure in place to meet their mandates. So it's really about being efficient and being cost effective. It does require a really large land footprint, and that's why we're looking at state lands. It's certainly from a development standpoint, there's a lot less engineering involved when you're, say, for example, putting solar on a cornfield. But really, from a land use perspective, that has trickle down effects throughout the agricultural community and a lot of rural places. And there's a lot of folks that, from a local standpoint, are against that type of development, in an agricultural or a rural setting. And so if you can look to do this in some of these former industrial sites, it's not really that different from what was there before. If the mine was there and it was, impacting the site and degrading it, solar is probably a step in the right direction. It's consistent with that type of industrial use, and sort of probably a better fit than using agricultural fields. And especially if you're taking steps to encourage pollinators and other things like that on those lands in conjunction with the solar, then it's a win-win.
And going beyond to incorporate solar into our built structures as well, getting to some of what George was talking about, multiple uses on a single site. Scott, I want to stick with you here. A question about carbon credits. Can you speak to benefits to society of continuing to manage our forests in the same way without dedicating them to carbon markets? What might be a benefit of continued management as we know it, and then what limitations or, I guess, different management techniques come in when we say that we are contributing the Pigeon River State Forest to a carbon market, for example?
Yeah, we're sensitive to that criticism, and so as we pilot this project, we want to do a couple of things. One is we want to make sure that the improved forest management techniques that we're using at that site really are meaningful. we're sensitive to the greenwashing argument, but we think that it really it helps in a lot of ways. And George talked about mass timber. I think economy wide, by supporting keeping forests as forests, even taking marginal farmland, maybe in the northern part of the state, that was marginal to begin with, it's no longer in production. If you can scale that up with planting trees, that's going to support a $22 billion forest industry in this state. And if you start looking at the ability of the industry to adapt to mass timber, it really points to a circular economy in keeping this land in a productive state, keeping it in forest. You're going to have those climate co-benefits like clean water, clean air. A lot of those things are going to be supported by that. And so as we go forward, we want to be sensitive to leakage. We want to be sensitive to some of these other things to make sure that we're doing this in a way that's not greenwashing, that truly is meaningful. And I don't think that carbon sequestration and selling carbon credits is it's not the only answer, and where it's not a panacea, but we think it's one piece of a very complex puzzle that we're able to contribute to. And if there's income generated from that and it goes back into improving our forests or creating resilient infrastructure in the forest, then that's probably a good thing. And I guess the last thing I would say is that the fact that we even have corporations like Apple, Google, Microsoft, even making Amazon making these commitments, and these commitments are for their employees, for their shareholders, for their customers. I think that's a really good place. Even that we're having those conversations. So as we go forward, I think there's it's only going to get better.
Well, we're on the topic of the state's land base and public lands as a resource. Does the DNR have a inventory of lands that would be suitable for utility scale solar, or have opportunities come up sort of on a case-by-case basis?
We have a pretty robust, as you can imagine, and with the forest planning that we do, we have a pretty robust GIS system. And so we have about 20 folks that work on spatial things every day, not just in forestry, but in a lot of different places with managing recreation, wildlife habitat, and others. So we've got a really good data set. As far as evaluating for solar, we're looking at that. The first step was putting these first 2 sites online, and there was definitely some lessons learned from that. Solar is not plug and play at all. It's each site that you're looking at is unique. It's like solving a little puzzle, an engineering puzzle on each site. Trying to, each site is specific to its conditions, soil substrates, grid capacity nearby, transmission and distribution capacity. So each one is a little bit different. But with that being said, we are looking at our land portfolio to look at where the next tranche of these projects is going to come online. And we're looking at sites that are don't have trees on them. They're not they're not in wildlife habitat. They're not habitat for grassland birds, things like that. It's a really pretty complex analysis to determine whether it would be appropriate to propose one of these sites come online for solar. And so we're looking at that right now. We're also, in contact with the development industry to make sure that they're aware of these efforts and making sure that it sort of fits their planning needs as well. So I guess the short answer is, yeah, we have a pretty good, analysis, and where we're just working through to make sure that there's no potential conflicts with other things that we're managing for.
Thanks. George, we've got some questions about mass timber here in terms of what the construction industry is thinking. Is this concept, is it starting to gain traction? Are there other commercial buildings that have used mass timber? I think the DNR, I think the state of Michigan has a mass timber building. But George, how is the industry in terms of its reception to mass timber?
So the hot spots for mass timber use in the U.S. have really been in the Pacific Northwest. They've been by far the market leader for getting this work done here in the U.S. We expect that we're going to see that changing considerably because the 2021 International Building Code, so the base building code that most jurisdictions in the U.S. use for commercial system or commercial buildings, will now permit mass timber building up to 18 stories in the base code. So we expect to see more of that coming. Milwaukee is putting on a 26-story mass timber building right now. Cleveland is putting on 11 to 12-story building. There's a couple other big ones that are planned. As you mentioned, the DNR is looking at putting a mass timber building in. We've had several conversations with other individuals in Michigan that are starting to get interested about what's going on. But it's like, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's like everything else in the construction industry. We are sort of we tend to be a slow industry to adopt new concepts. You know, we don't do change real well in this industry. So it just takes a while for some of these things to catch on. We've done some work on what some of the barriers are for industry to adopt mass timber. And some of it, frankly, just comes down to education. So we've put more of a focus on trying to educate students so that way when they get out of school and get into the industry, they're the ones that are starting to push, you know, some of this change from the ground up. But interestingly enough, the erector for the timber on the MSU project, which it's Chrisman Constructors, so Chrisman Construction here in Lansing, it's their self-perform group. They are now doing another mass timber building in Virginia. So they're the erector on an 8-story, I believe it is, building in Charlottesville. And they're really getting pretty interested and excited about mass timber construction in general. So I think they're going to start to cement themselves as a leader in the general contracting industry around doing timber regionally here in Michigan.
You mentioned the building code, and certainly as it relates to sustainability, we have insulation requirements in the building code, right, across different types of structures. Is it crazy to think about mandatory energy generation as part of the construction code, George? Is that something we're going to see soon, where every new building needs to be able to generate its own electricity? Are we close to that?
I think we're going to start to see market pressure in that regard. U.S. Green Building Council, which is the parent organization for LEED certification for green buildings, has a goal that between 2030 and 2050, that they're going to transition their standard to being one that expects buildings to be restorative and regenerative. So if you expect your built environment to function in that way, to restore some, you know, natural function back to the ground or the land where the buildings are built, and be regenerative in that way, I think you're going to start to see market pressure driven down from groups like USGBC to start to incorporate net zero practices, which obviously then include the ability to generate energy on site at building locations.
Yeah, interesting. So many possibilities with that, where the building is really a almost alive, almost a entity to itself that can produce its own energy and maybe in some ways handle its own waste. Aaron, you mentioned the Asset Management Champion Program. Is it too late to join in? How does someone get connected to that program that kicks off this week?
I saw that question, and I actually have an email into the MIC executive director to see if there's still room. So if that individual wants to reach out to me, I'd be happy to connect the two of them and see if there's room to add anybody.
Okay, maybe the individual that asked that question could put a chat to participants or our panelists with your email, and we can connect the two of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the hope is to not be a one and done program. We're hoping to do more programs into the future. So if you're not able to get in, stay tuned and let us know that you're interested, and we'll hope to get another one up and running at a later date.
So certainly part of our resilient and sustainable future is internet connectivity, right? The Internet of Things, and communications between systems. Are we talking about broadband as part of the asset management discussion in Michigan? I know we
Yes.
certainly need to expand broadband as far as economic development, and economic developers talk that way, but as far as asset management, is it part of that collection of assets?
Yes, broadband is a big part also of what we're talking about at the Michigan Infrastructure Council. The Michigan Public Service Commission is sitting at the table with us, and there has been conversations across the state from many different sectors. I know my counterparts at regions across the state have had many conversations, and we're looking at how can we work across the state, but again, touching the local governments and the local communities that we represent regionally. There have been conversations, we knew prior to COVID that broadband was an issue. Now it's an even greater issue because everybody's working from home. Children are doing schooling from home. We're doing telemedicine. And so it's a huge issue. So all of these different sectors are really, and again, doing their own thing, looking at how they can solve the broadband issue. So we're trying to see how we can bring all those sectors together, have a louder voice, and address the issue collectively. Again, from K through 12, higher education, the business community, the healthcare community, how can we all work together to solve this issue? There's a big phone call that I'm participating in on Monday, trying to pull together all the statewide associations that are looking at these issues. One of the main issues too to solve is where broadband is and isn't. When you look at the FCC mapping, the criteria for identifying a census tract as being covered with broadband is if one household within that census tract has broadband, the entire census block can be shown as covered. We know that those maps are very skewed because of that. So how can we identify where that coverage is and isn't? And looking, using the state and federal dollars that have been allocated recently and probably into the future to address those issues, to identify that. And then looking at, there's also two other issues, it's access, where is it, where it isn't, but also adoption rates and why aren't people able to take advantage of the high-speed internet that they do have. And those approaches are very different per community, and every community is different. So looking at, how can we, again, look at it collectively, but then address those issues that vary from community to community.
Thanks. We've got some more questions. I think I'm going to end on a big kind of overarching question that I'd like all three of our panelists to address. We know local government school systems will be receiving significant funding from the federal government here over the next few years. We also know about President Biden's infrastructure proposal. Certainly in Michigan, we've been talking infrastructure a long time, and roads have been the tip of the iceberg with that discussion. But as you've mentioned, Aaron, there's all kinds of other infrastructure to talk about. Could each panelist maybe take a crack at just what this opportunity is here in the next few years with what seems to be alignment of some key things. Funding has always been an issue. We haven't had funding to really improve our infrastructure to make it resilient. Maybe you could each leave us on a thought as it relates to the convergence and the opportunity that we have here in the next several years. Anyone want to start us off on that?
I'll start off if that's okay. I think we have a great opportunity here in the state of Michigan to build upon what we've done through the Michigan Infrastructure Council and looking at this infrastructure collectively on how we can coordinate large-scale projects in areas all across the state of Michigan and coordinate this funding to make it the limited dollars, even though it's going to be a lot of dollars coming down the pike here. We know that it's probably not enough to solve all of the issues that we have. So we are in a unique situation that other states might not be in the fact that we're already far enough down that road to collaborate and coordinate these projects, one, through the project portal, and two, through using asset management across sectors, infrastructure sectors, to make those dollars go even farther. So I think we're in a unique situation. And I know my counterparts through the Michigan Association of Regions are already looking at how we can, at a regional scale, work with our local units of government that are going to be getting these funds. How can we help them to maybe coordinate on whether it's, doing coordination of RFPs to do projects or bidding for projects. And then how can we as regions help them access these federal dollars that are coming in and be that just that coordinator of projects under knowing what's happening within our region and how we can then connect different projects again to make those dollars go farther.
Thanks, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
I can kind of chime in on that as well, Brad. So from the DNR's perspective, I think there's a couple opportunities. One is where we have good data, we can be, so we will understand what the need is. And so where we have our road system well inventoried, the bridges, culverts identified, we're that much closer to being able to provide engineering to know what a resilient built climate-proof infrastructure is going to look like there. So that's one opportunity but we don't have that everywhere. We don't have a lot of our assets, especially things like bridges, culverts. We don't have a great inventory system of those. Now we're working on it, but where we do have that, we're ahead and we'll be able to potentially apply some of those federal dollars there. Where we don't have that yet, perhaps we can use the federal dollars or the Civilian Climate Corps to maybe do some of that work and get us where we need to be. But a lot of it points to that the need for the asset management, the need for those good inventories, and when you're dealing with the natural environment, it's a little bit different. It's a little trickier situation. We have a lot of foresters on staff and wildlife biologists. We don't have a lot of road engineers in the DNR. So it's those things all sort of play into this. And so we've got a infrastructure backlog that really needs to be addressed. And so there's an opportunity here. It's just how we position ourselves to take advantage of that.
Thanks. And George?
Since I was covering a little bit of a different take on the topic, I think our perspective is that as communities start thinking about what they want the future of their built environment to look like and how that compares to what's on the ground today, there's certainly opportunities for policy tools that recognize the importance of not simply carting material off to the landfill. There's economic opportunities in developing salvage and reuse industries. We've done some work at MSU, not out so much out of my unit, but out of the Center for Community and Economic Development that's led by Dr. Rex Lamore on some of that work and how working toward a built environment that's really meant to be disassembled at the end of its useful life, how that can also promote some economic activity at the local level. And then, of course, the mass timber piece right now is kind of the Wild West. And so we need local building officials that get familiar with what's coming down the pike in terms of the new building code, and really understand how those techniques and those materials can be an important part of a built environment strategy for them that's both, you know, durable, long lasting, but that also has some environmental benefit built into it as well.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters, Aaron, Scott, George. Really appreciate your time that you dedicated to this. I want to thank our participants. I want to also thank the partners in the Resiliency Planning webinar series, detailed here on the slide. And I want to remind everyone about our next session, the final session in the series, how to plan and design for known hazards, the next steps. And we will have another great panel of individuals presenting next week for us. So thanks to everyone. It's the top of the hour, and we appreciate you spending the time with us. Share any feedback you have with the emails that you've been connected with. So thanks again to our presenters.